All right, guys, thanks again for joining us for this webinar today. We're going to be covering some really interesting creative look building, both on set and in post. So we're going to be looking at how to light and color correct for three distinct looks. The first one being the comedy look, which is a really bright and inviting look that works well for comedic films or commercials. Then we're going to look at the Bleach Bypass look, which is a more intense, gritty, cooler, sort of more raw look that we're, again, going to look at both in production and post. And finally, we're going to look at the film noir look, which many of you are familiar with from not only classic 40s and 50s black and white films, but also from neo-noir films today that make just as much use of that really distinct lighting and color correction characteristics. So all three of these looks are going to use the same three lights. It's just a matter of modifying the lights differently, in some cases not using all three lights and only using two of the three, and adjusting the way that we're using them. So to start this off, we're going to try to build the comedy look. And to do that, we're actually going to start from a baseline of nothing. We want to have 0 lights on in here, including the house lights. So I'm actually going to turn these house lights off right now. And as you can see on our monitor that we're going to cut to, obviously we're just seeing black. That's what we want. We don't want any spill. We don't want any window light interfering with what we're trying to do. And I am now going to turn on our key light. So this key light, as you can obviously see in the monitor here, is creating a really soft, dramatic light, and it's been strategically positioned and modified to create the look that you're seeing right now. So what we're using is a mole LED. It's shooting straight through a silk, which is modifying the light and softening it. And later on in the webinar, we're going to show you what happens when you don't modify in the film noir look. But for now, we have this really soft light, and we're placing it above and to the side of the talent. And the reason we're doing that is because it creates pleasing shadows and a bit more of a three-dimensional look. If you were to put that light right in front of your talent's face, it's going to look really washed out, and it's going to just look flat and sort of boring looking. Unless you're going for a really old sort of corporate video look, chances are you're going to want to move your light off to the side a little bit and get those shadows. The caveat to doing this is that when you're working with the film look, you don't always want those really, when you're working with the comedy look, you don't always want those really harsh shadows. Comedy is all about bright and inviting and happy. So what we're going to do is use a fill light, which is effectively placed on the exact opposite side of our key light, on the opposite side of the talent, and is a nice soft source that's going to fill in some of those shadows on the opposite side of the face. So let's go turn that on and take a look and see what that does. So as you can see right off the bat, we're getting a nice fill on that side of the face, and we can actually use this light panel. It's a fantastic light to dial up or down the intensity. So that's completely off, and if we were to take it all the way up, it's going to be far too bright, and it's actually going to compete with our key light, which is exactly what we don't want, because then we get that really washed out look. So I'm going to turn it down quite a bit. We're just going to have it just barely on enough that it's starting to fill up those shadows, and it's starting to really make his face look great, where we get the best of both worlds. We get the shadows from our soft key light, but we have them filled in enough that they don't feel really dramatic and too heavy. That's going to sort of take away from that lighter feel that we're going for creatively. So now we're going to turn on our third light, which is at the back here, and it's placed again directly above and behind. In this case, we're off a little bit, but oftentimes you'll go right behind your talent. It really depends on the look you're going for. And this is effectively going to work as a hair light. So right now we don't have barn doors or flags or anything like that. If we wanted to control this light a little bit more, we would certainly be able to do that. However, in its current state, and I'm going to take a look here at the monitor myself, in its current state, you can tell that obviously it's creating a little bit more of an edge and a little bit more of a rim around our talent. So that's what we're looking for, and that more or less completes the basic three-point lighting setup for a comedy look. Which, by the way, is similar to a lot of other three-point setups. If you're doing an interview shoot, or if you're doing a dramatic scene that's not too heavy and you want to make it feel a little bit lighter, this is a really, really basic and standard setup. We haven't fine-tuned this to any degree. Keep in mind, when you are shooting something, you're going to want to add more modifiers. You're going to soften certain lights. You're going to dial things up or down more strategically to your liking. But as a starting point, this is generally the setup that you're going to want to use. So moving forward from here, let's take a look at how we can now modify this setup to get to the Bleach Bypass look. And then we're going to look at Film Noir a little bit later. So the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go back to our fill light, and I'm going to turn that off. And what that's doing is it's effectively giving us a really powerful 2-light setup now. So we have our key light, which again is creating those more defined shadows, which we want for the Bleach Bypass look because that's a bit more of an intense look. We don't need to fluff it up as much and make it feel as polished. But we also have that hair light, which is really nice in the back because it adds a little bit of an edge to our subject, and it makes it allows the subject to separate themselves a little bit more from the background. One important thing to note when you're looking at a Bleach Bypass look, and this is actually true of a lot of color looks, is that some looks are more dependent on the lighting setup than others. So for example, Film Noir is really all about the lighting. There are certainly things that you can and need to do in post to really emphasize that. But something like Bleach Bypass is more about the color correction than it is about the actual lighting setup. That's not to say the lighting doesn't matter, but it is to say that you could take various different types of lighting setups and give them all that same color look in DaVinci or whatever color software that you're using, if you choose to do so. So to illustrate that, we're actually going to keep this setup exactly as is, which is very, very similar to what we had with the comedy look, only removing that fill light, and we're going to see just how different that is when we get to the editing room. The final look here that we're going to be exploring is the Film Noir look, as I mentioned before. So the big thing that you have to focus on with Film Noir are shadows. You want really harsh, crisp, defined shadows because that's what's going to separate this from almost any other look. In modern cinematography, it's really the popular thing to do is to make everything soft. People want faces to look more pleasing and more beautiful, and when you soften light, that's exactly what it does. Film Noir, on the other hand, is all about creating these really defined shadows and finding the contrast between light and dark in the maximum, to the maximum degree that that's possible. So the first thing that we're going to do, keeping the 2 lights on that we have on right now, is we're actually going to remove our flag, and we'll take a look at what this, we're going to remove our silk, and we'll take a look at what this does to the light on our subject. So let's start by pulling this down. And right off the bat, you're going to notice that the light on the subject's face is much harsher, much more defined. In fact, it's so strong that on the camera right now, it's actually pretty overexposed. So we're going to have to go into the camera and make an adjustment. I'm actually going to turn on an additional ND filter to compensate for that. Another option would have been to dial the light down. This particular LED light actually has the ability to dial up or down. But if you're not working with that kind of light, or if you're on an older tungsten light or whatever fixture you may be using, you can always add an ND filter or adjust your exposure settings in camera to compensate. So right now, we are already pretty close to that Film Noir look. This, again, if this was a film set, we'd be taking a lot of time to tweak this and dial in our exact settings and positioning of the light in a more strategic way. But for the purpose of this webinar, hopefully you can see right away that just by removing that silk and adjusting our exposure settings in camera, we're getting those shadows. We're getting this really defined shadow on the wall. We're getting a very high contrast image. So when we couple this with the techniques in the color suite that we're going to be employing, you're going to see that when you bring those 2 elements together, that look is going to look really, really fantastic and really distinct. So you'll notice that I've kept on the hair light. The hair light's great because, again, it's helping to separate our talent from the background. It's already a hard light, so we didn't have to make any adjustments to that to fit with the Film Noir look. And that is more or less the essence of those 3 looks. The last thing that I'll tack on for film noir look is if you ever want to add, as sort of a bonus tip, if you ever want to add even more defined shadows, you can use elements in front of your lens, like a cookie or anything else even that's homemade, to create the look of blinds or the look of vertical lines on your subject. That's a very characteristic technique that is used time and time and time again with the film noir genre and film noir cinematography. So now let's jump into the color room and see how we can take all of these three looks into DaVinci Resolve and really emphasize what we just did in the color suite. All right, so here we are in DaVinci Resolve, and we're going to be looking at three clips that we just shot a moment ago. The first one, as you can see here, is our comedy look, which is our really nice bright footage. The second one is our Bleach Bypass look, and it's obviously very similar. As you probably remember, we did turn off the fill light, so we have a little bit more shadow, and we lose the hot spot as well in the background there. And then our third and final look is going to be the film noir look, which is the most distinct and most obvious of the three from a stylistic standpoint. So let's kick things off here and look at the comedy look. So here we are in the comedy look. We're already pretty close. If you shot your image the way that you're supposed to on set and you use a lot of light and it's a really bright image, then there's not usually going to be too much work to do once you get to post-production other than your usual color correction. So you might want to balance your image. In this case, as bright as we are, we're actually a little too bright for my taste, so I'm going to bring the highlights down just a touch so it doesn't look like it's almost about to clip. I'm actually gonna bring my midtones down a little bit just to bring in a little more contrast and then bring the shadows back up. So I'm just gonna toggle this grade on and off. So right now it's off, and then when I put it back on, not a huge difference. It just sort of polishes up the image. Again, this particular adjustment isn't really specific to the comedy look. This is just something that you're gonna wanna do across any look just to clean up your footage. One thing that's really important with comedy, anything comedy related or any sort of light scene, you want to make sure your midtones are in a good place. And what I mean by that is you want to make sure that the skin tones are bright and very inviting looking. So in this shot, they already are in that space, but I'll just simulate what it would look like here if we had underexposed. Let's say we bring in the footage and maybe someone else shot this and you're coloring it, and it looks sort of like this. So it's going to look a little muddy, a little flat. Your blacks are a little too dark and your highlights aren't really bright enough. Even without adjusting anything other than the midtones, we can get this to look a lot better. So I'm going to add another node here, another serial node, and I'm just going to bring up the midtones. And I'm going to bring them up to a point where I feel like they're looking like they're around sort of a neutral or slightly above a neutral gray point to my eye. Obviously, you can use scopes for this. That would be a whole webinar in itself, so we're not going to go too far into detail for that. But this alone is a really good starting point if you're working with underexposed footage. You can then bring up your highlights a little more and bring your shadows down to give yourself some more contrast. And again, if we compare this to our original, compared to the original, we've brought it down, but compared to our previous underexposed simulation, we've brought it up. So again, comedy's all about finding that middle ground. Once in a while in certain shots, a lot of people like to add power windows. Personally, I don't usually recommend that for the majority of comedy shots, and I'll show you why. But when you're doing a dramatic film or a genre piece, a horror, you might want to add a window and sort of bring this in a little bit. With comedy, it sort of takes away from that really bright, beautiful aesthetic that is supposed to look more inviting and happier. It's not to say you can't break the rules sometimes, but in this particular case, we'll probably turn that off and save that for one of our other looks down the line. So just to summarize, comedy look, all about the midtones, brighten things up, keep them bright, but not so bright that they're going to clip. Always make sure that your saturation is in a good point as well. Again, we did what we needed to do on set and actually shot not in a log color space, which is why our colors are looking pretty good here. But if we wanted to, we can increase the saturation a touch as well, just to sort of brighten things up and make it look that much more inviting. So let's move on from here and take a look at more of a stylized look, which is going to be our Bleach Bypass look. So the first thing to look at here is what we did. Let's just take a reminder of exactly what we did differently when we shot it, which was really only the one light. So on the right side of our talent's face, we're seeing a little bit more shadow on his cheek and on the side of his nose, and that's because our fill light's off. So this is sort of optional when it comes to Bleach Bypass. As I mentioned during the production side of this webinar, a lot of the look is really what we're going to do right here in post. And the first thing that you want to do to start off in as far as color is concerned is you want to add a nice amount of contrast. So right now we're actually starting with a fairly contrasty image because again we did our job and we shot it that way, but I'm actually going to turn up the contrast a little bit more here, and we're going to take things almost too far and then we're going to back them off. So I turned up the contrast. Then I'm going to lift up the blacks a little so we're not as shadowy and as crushed. And then I'm going to bring down the highlights and bring up the mids. So this is far from our final look, but we did manage to add a little bit of contrast and make the image a little bit punchier. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to start bringing some of the color into this. And because there's several different phases we're going to go through with the Bleach Bypass look, it's going to start to look a little bit funny for a couple of these stages until we get to the very end. So bear with me as we push this very blue. Bleach Bypass often has sort of a bluish or greenish tinge to it. So I'm going to start with our midtones, as you see here, and then I'm going to push a little bit of... I'm actually going to go the other way in this case and push a little bit of green and some warmth into the highlights, and then I'm going to go back to our shadows and I'm going to add some blue there. So what you'll notice that happens as I'm pushing the blue in, as I'm adding color to the shadows and to the midtones, it's actually lifting up those elements. So it's bringing up the levels. So what we're going to do now is create another node. We're going to bring those back down. And there's a bit of what's called a push-pull method, where you're going to push in one direction, it's going to go too far, and you're going to pull back in the other direction. So we're going to take things, we're just going to mess around with the color wheels a little bit and take things a little too far, make things a little too blue. And then on a separate node, we're going to desaturate significantly. So we're going to bring the saturation way down, not to the point where it's going to look black and white, but just to the point where we have a much more subtle effect. So if I turn this off, we have a very blue sort of look. It's a bit of a color cast to it. And here we're getting a lot closer to a Bleach Bypass look. So to fine tune this now, I would probably take another node and I'd actually increase my contrast a little bit more by bringing the highlights back up and crushing the shadows a little bit more while I lift up the mids again to try to find that balance. And that is getting us pretty close to what we might consider a final look. So here's our before and here's our after. And we can step through each of these nodes to show you exactly what each of them is doing. And again, the idea was to cool it down to a point where it's too far, then desaturate, and then do some final adjustments to it to get that greenish blue high contrast look that we're after. So let's go now to our very final look, which is going to be our film noir look. So obviously we shot this with a hard direct light source, which is why we have these harsh shadows on our talent's face, and that's exactly what we wanted. But that's not where it's going to end, because we also need to make sure that this is stylized and colored in a way that's conducive to the noir look. Obviously the standard thing to do, and the first thing you're going to want to do is desaturate. You're going to want a black and white image. So we're going to do that right away. And right off the bat, again, we're pretty close to our look here because we actually have done our job on set, like I said before, and we've created those pockets of light and shadow. Had you not done that, I'm actually going to reset this and I'll show you. Let's say we didn't quite make it as contrasty as we would have liked on set, and we're starting more from a point like this, which is common, especially if you're shooting on a log setting. You're going to want to reverse what I just did. So you're going to want to add contrast, pull the blacks down, push the whites up, again, to a point right before it clips, maybe add a little contrast. Use your discretion to sort of pump in as much light as you can to the highlights and make the shadows as dark as possible. So once you've done that, once you've found your basic balance, and again, you've desaturated the image, as you can see here, then you can stylize it even further. So if you wanted to, you could bring your midtones down. You could go really stylized with this. I'll take this even past where I would probably do this if this was my own personal project, but you can take it to that level so you're getting that really extreme look. And then this is where, again, you might want to use a window. So I typically recommend, if you are going to try to use a power window, or if you're going to try to create any sort of depth in post-production, to first try to see if you can do this during while you're on set and during the production phase, because that is more conducive to the original 40s, 50s film noir look. Believe it or not, DaVinci Resolve didn't exist back then, and there were only practical ways to do this. But if you wanted to, you can, as you see here, you can actually create a window. And if I turn it off and turn it on, it's just sort of eliminating this hot spot on the left side of the frame and drawing your attention right into the center. So again, it's really up to your discretion how far you want to take this look. This is certainly one variation of the look. You can also turn off some of these nodes, and this would be another variation that's just as legitimate of a film noir look. It really just depends on your personal preference as a filmmaker and how far you want to take things. So obviously, just to circle back and go through these one at a time. So we have all three of these were shot with the exact same lights in the exact same positions. We have our comedy look, our Bleach Bypass look, and our film noir look. So other than some very minor tweaks on set and a little bit of difference in the color room, you can get these three distinct looks very, very easily, just by approaching things in a strategic way. All right, well, thank you guys so much again for tuning in. I really hope that you've learned something about these three looks in particular, and also just understanding how effective color grading can be, and how when you find the balance between proper lighting when you're on set doing your production work and proper color grading can really bring you the best possible image when you maximize both of those components. So I hope you learned something, and we'll see you next time on Moviola.